Here we go. Good morning, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about general addendum usage and the clause library and how to use a form clause library. We'll kind of broadly touch upon it. It's a concept that Oregon Realtors has been working on. We haven't released it yet because it's still under review from our forms task force, but it's something that should be happening in the near future because it's written, or large chunks of it are written at this stage. So what we're going to talk about today is essentially general addendums and how they're used and how they work. And then we're going to talk about what a clause library is, how it's used, what it does. If you're at a brokerage that one of the larger brokerages, or in some cases some of the more sophisticated brokerages will have their own internal clause library, that's great. We're not saying use this as a replacement. We're just saying it's an option. And having more language for your clauses is better for the practice as a whole. In general, when we're talking about general addendums, this is what they look like. This is the Oregon Realtors General Addendum. It's Form 2.2. This is pretty much the entirety of it. The only thing that's left over is more blank lines to fill in more general addendum language, as well as the signatures of the parties on the general addendum. You'll note you have the property address and description, the names of the parties. That's going to be pretty much the same in every single document. And then you have the description of the addendum. In a general addendum, you do want to note what addendum it is. Say it's addendum 1, 2, 3, ABC, whatever it ends up being. Give it a notation that makes it unique. You can even do, I've seen in some cases people write it out, addendum buyer gets contingent right, or something along those lines. You can write out very distinct explanations of it, but make it clear. What you don't want is for someone to say, yeah, general addendum 1, and you've got 6 documents that are all labeled general addendum 1, because now you have no idea what the parties are talking about. And the point of this is that you're going to have some pretty specific information in each general addendum, and you want each one to be differentiable from the others. You'll note also it has this little fun thing at the bottom. The parties agree as follows. General addendums work as a modification to the existing sales agreement language. It can be used to provide notices, it can be used to lock in affidavit language, and it can be used to add language. All 3 of those are viable uses for a general addendum, and it will get used in all 3 capacities pretty regularly. Contractually, if we were really kind of doing this the way that law really wants you to use a general addendum, it is only used to add language or to lock in affidavit language. Notices don't require a general addendum, but because brokers in most cases only really have these general addendums as their tool for this, then in most cases we'll also see people who provide notice on a general addendum. The general addendum starts with its fancy little language here that talks about how it modifies the referenced sale agreement. So if the language from the base agreement conflicts with the language from the addendum will overwrite all of those conflicting terms. The literal reading on this is this addendum 1 modifies the above referenced sales agreement. Upon a mutual acceptance of this addendum by buyer and seller, the terms of this addendum are made part of the sales agreement. To the extent that the terms or provisions in this addendum conflict with terms or provisions in the sales agreement, the terms or provisions of this addendum will control. All provisions of the sales agreement not modified by this addendum will remain unchanged. So that last line is important. We'll talk about this. What you'll note here is that upon mutual addendum language is important. It's very relevant. You don't actually make the language of your general addendum part of the sales agreement until both parties agree with it. Now, if I have a general addendum that says the parties agree, buyer is giving notice to seller that the following information is true, and the buyer sends that to the seller has received notice. The notice generally doesn't need to be part of the sales agreement. So you can use these to provide notice. You could also just use an email to provide notice, but people are using it this way anyway, so let's keep going. So if you don't have the other party sign it, if I'm just sending you notice on a general addendum and the seller refuses to sign my notice has still been delivered. It's just not part of the sales agreement. So if we were to grab the packet of documents that are the sales agreement, it wouldn't include that notice, but notice has still been delivered. So if you are providing notice on a general addendum, you don't need a signature by the other party. Not really what the general addendum is intended for, but it can be used that way, and that's the way a lot of people use it. So if that is the way you like using general addendums, proceed. Otherwise, when you give someone a general addendum, they have to sign it. Otherwise, it doesn't become part of the agreement. If it does become part of the agreement, if both parties sign it, you overlap it on top of the sales agreement, and anything that overlaps now becomes the language of the agreement. Anything that doesn't overlap remains unchanged. Silly example, but let's say this is what's happening. Closing date, October 15th, 2023. Possession date, October 30th, 2023. Let's say that's what the original contract read. What this means is you've got somebody that's moving in midway through October and possession happens a half a month later. You've got an occupy after closing addendum or agreement of some sort. So somebody's living there for a little while afterwards. Let's say the parties want to modify the possession date so that it will instead be November 30th, 2023. You're giving them an extra month. Instead of 15 days of occupancy, it's 31. I don't remember how many days are in October. I think it's 30. So that would be an extra 30 days of occupancy. And so the parties want to modify it to give possession way out in the future. It's going to be November 30th now. So what the parties would do is they would just write in the parties want, like if they want to modify that possession date, they would write in the parties agree as follows, possession date to be November 30th, 2023. Pretty straightforward. This is the way most people use them. This is the way it's supposed to be used. Now let's say the parties want to modify the closing date to be November 15th and they want the possession date to be November 30th. And they write in agreement. The parties agree as follows. Closing date to be November 15th, 2023. Because we did have that 15-day occupancy after closing. As you could see back in the original language, it was a 15-day occupancy after closing. So what we're going to do is we'll set it up so that the closing date is November 15th. And we assume, therefore, that surely since the original possession date was 15 days after closing, that if you change the closing date, that'll move the possession date as well, right? That is not how this works. That is simply incorrect. If you want to modify multiple timelines, multiple provisions, you have to specify them. So if I want to move the closing date, I have to say it. Closing date to be November 15th, 2023. Possession date to be November 30th, 2023. I have to specify both of those. Now, if I only do what this originally one did, closing date to be November 15th, 2023. Do we have a weird situation? Yes, because now possession date is still established based on the original terms of the contract. Possession date October 30th, closing is now November 15th. You've gone from a buyer letting the seller live in the property until or for 30 days after closing to suddenly now it's a seller letting the buyer move in before the closing date, because the parties have forgotten to put in the most important thing. This thought process, well, it seems, if this seems ridiculous to you, then good, proceed as normal. If this is something you've done, stop it. That's not good. Don't do this. It's bad for you. When you use a general addendum, specify with as much clarity as you possibly can. I'm going to belabor the point a lot because this is something that comes up on the hotline with regularity. People use general addendums incorrectly a lot. When you use a general addendum and you overlap a term, but you've got some addition. So let's say this was the main contract and you've got the general addendum that overlaps and it's got some pieces that cut out, you know, like this would be the closing date is moved, but you've added some other provision. You've created a new shape. When the general addendum language overlaps, it overwrites. That piece is removed. It's erased from the contract. If for whatever reason the parties say, you know what, backtrack that. Take back everything we said in General Addendum 1. Now, you won't see this often, but you can do this sort of thing. Or let's say for whatever reason General Addendum 1 is invalidated or it's incorrect or it got signed by the wrong person or something like that. Then you have an instance where you've potentially overwritten a part of your contract, you've cut out a chunk of the original sales agreement, and now you don't have that general addendum anymore. So be cautious when you do general addendums, because if you do terminate just the general addendum language, the stuff that it overwrote doesn't come back. It doesn't reconstitute the pieces that were overwritten. And so if you have a general addendum that is undoing a piece of your original contract, don't ever, my best advice to legal risk management in this case is never terminate specifically a general addendum, because that will cause many problems for you. Instead, the best approach is, if you're going to terminate something because the general addendum information is now incorrect, terminate the whole thing. Terminate the entire contract rather than just the general addendum. Comparison to how a counteroffer works. If you deliver a counteroffer, you already overwrite the entire sales agreement. The whole thing is gone. What this means is once the counteroffer is decided invalid or it's withdrawn, or if the parties terminate that counteroffer, you don't get the original thing back. The shape is gone. So if you have that original sales agreement, you overwrite it with the counteroffer, it's now no longer in existence. It's not a thing anymore. By contrast with the general addendum, if you have a sales agreement and there are pieces that remained untouched by the general addendum, those pieces will still remain. You'll still have some of that original sales agreement in place. Things to consider while drafting a general addendum. In the language of general addendum, consider whether the addendum language overlaps or works alongside the previous language. So, for example, the buyer has 10 business days to do their due diligence or to complete all their inspections, surveys, tests, and all the negotiations and all that stuff. They have a 10-day due diligence period. Pretty normal, that's the default. Let's say in a general addendum, you say buyer has 5 business days after mutual acceptance to have the property inspected for pests. Question for the class, let's see responses. Does this change the due diligence period? See one answer that's a yes. So if I say buyer has 5 business days after mutual acceptance to have the property inspected for pests, can the buyer still do surveys and tests and other due diligence? Or have they taken their due diligence period and now it's only 5 days long? Or is there a 10-day due diligence period and also a simultaneous 5-day pest inspection period? I see a yes, I see a no, I see a both. Both. You got the diligence period and a pest inspection period, simultaneous, correct. So if you put in language like this that says buyer has 5 business days after mutual acceptance to have the property inspected for pests, you've reasonably created a new 5-day inspection period just for pests. Now here's the thing, here's the kicker. This due diligence period is modified slightly. This means you have 10 days to do due diligence, but you don't have 10 days to look into pests. You only have 5 days to look into pests. And so it ends up taking what was normally the due diligence period, for lack of a better description. It's a bundle of sticks. You've got all kinds of things. You can look into zoning, you can look into the pests, you can look at the oil tanks, you can do whole house inspections, all those things. One of those sticks has been removed and it's been snapped in half. Now you have a bundle of sticks minus one and a half a stick. That's the end result of this kind of general addendum language, which is why you want to be careful, because if the intent behind this general addendum was what we really want is for the parties to lose their right to do all in various inspections. They are waiving their due diligence period, but we'll give them 5 days to do their pest inspection. You need to state that. Simply saying buyer has 5 days for after mutual acceptance to have the property inspected for pests does not overwrite or get rid of the due diligence period. If, by contrast, you want to give the buyer a really express 5 days to look into some object and you want to keep the due diligence period, you don't have to mention buyer gets to retain their due diligence period because that language stays the same. This one comes up on the hotline a lot, more than I would ever want it to. Merely more detail is always preferable. This is a thing to always do in your general addendums. More is better than less. Parties will not and should not imply information from a provision. Assuming things will always cause problems. So if, for example, your agreement states the parties agree as follows: buyer has a contingency. That's not good general addendum drafting. That's a problem because buyer has a contingency that both parties agree to. What are we going to do now? The problem with most of this is in contracts, there's a concept that basically everything has to be in writing. It doesn't technically have to be in writing for everything. There are kind of breaches to that in contract law where you can have things implied by actions of the parties. But the more you have something in writing, the better. The less something is in writing, the more conflict and the more confusion you're going to have between the parties. Something for, see now, that's a good question in the chat there, Kat. A contingency for what? If you're going to add a contingency, really talk about it. We've literally had this come up in the hotline a couple of times where somebody has something that says, oh, buyer gets their contingency. And everyone kind of understood that that meant a contingent right to purchase or a contingency to inspect the property for all kinds of other stuff, whatever it ends up being. But if you don't specify, theoretically, it doesn't mean anything. Buyer has a contingency. Okay. Contingent upon what? We're going to assume that it's fulfilled, it's not fulfilled. In most cases, if you have something like this, a general addendum that provides useless language, you can go to court or mediation, arbitration, that sort of thing, and get what's in law called a reformation of a contract. The judge basically looks at the contract and rewrites it in the way that is compliant with the law. The judge, when they reform things, they don't add language. The judge will never say buyer has a contingency. Well, what they meant there is buyer has a contingent right to sell their property for the next 30 days, but if they don't sell their property, they have to tell the buyer or seller about it, and the seller has a right to continue listing their property and advertising and a pending status until they won't do that. The court would look at it and say buyer has a contingency. Based upon nothing, we're assuming it's fulfilled. That contract has been reformed. Now it's a legal contract. So in most cases, the courts will make subtractive changes to a form. They won't make additive changes if they are doing reformation. So something like a general addendum, if written improperly, will amount to very little or no change to the contract when you might want it to make a significant change. So more detail is better than less. Bear with me. This is going to get a little patronizing for a second. Think about writing an addendum, kind of like you're doing that how do you make a peanut butter jelly sandwich assignment from first grade, right? If you do it poorly, step 1, stick the knife in the peanut butter jar. Step 2, spread the peanut butter. It doesn't work like intended. So it is childlike, I understand, but that how to make a peanut butter jelly sandwich assignment is a great way to understand general addendums and how to write them. For those of you that don't know what that assignment is, or you didn't have that assignment, the whole premise of it is you take in like first grade or second grade or some odd, you would have a kid and you would say, okay, I want you to write out the rules, the instructions. How do you make a peanut butter jelly sandwich? And the kid is supposed to explain to you every step that goes into it, and you read them literally. If they don't tell you to open the cabinet, you bash your hands into the cabinet and say, I can't reach the peanut butter jar. All the rest of the steps become nonsensical at that point because the first step has failed. If it's something like they tell you put the knife in the peanut butter jar, but they don't tell you to take the lid off, then you whack the knife on the top and you say, what am I supposed to do? Clarity is important. The premise of that assignment for like the first grade reading things is to basically explain why detail and why specificity and why process are so important for actually providing clarity. You have to assume that the other party is not reading the contract with your eyes. They are reading it with their eyes. If you read the contract and go, well, obviously when I said give a contingency, it meant the contingency that is in the favor of buyer. The seller is going to look at it and say, buyer has a contingency that's in favor of seller, right? That's what we're going for. You each are coming at it from different directions. And so a general addendum needs to be drafted in a way that makes utter clarity the goal of the general addendum. You can make it very complicated in this regard. So if you are doing it properly, it can be a lot of work. It can be something, and this is just kind of a silly example, using the fingers of your right hand on the corner of the cabinet to the right of the fridge, open the cabinet 90 degrees outwards. Using the fingers of the right hand in a wide pincher motion, apply light pressure to the peanut butter container, 8 inches from the right hand inside wall of the cabinet, and gently squeeze the middle of the peanut butter container with consistent pressure, and so on and so forth. This is the way that addendum language can be done. You can write it in a way that is so absolutely clear that literally everyone knows what it says. Now, your parties will usually hate you if you write this way. That's why lawyers are so unpopular in the world, is this is largely the way lawyers are taught to write. We are taught to write in a manner that means no one can misinterpret the language. When your client gets handed a 9-page long general addendum, they're going to give you an odd look. So you have to find some way of splitting the distance between the peanut butter jar with a knife in it and the robotic explanation of what you are doing. That is on you guys as brokers to figure out where in the middle of that you want to fall. But it also needs to be something where your client, to a certain extent, has at least a say in the matter. If you explain to your client, hey, we're going to write a contingency in a general addendum, we can be really specific, but the other party might get scared away because we're going to flop a huge document in front of them. Or we can be not very specific, but be aware things can get lost in the cracks. We'll do our best, but which one do you want to see? And if the client is super loosey-goosey with their risk, they might say, you know what, just write the 6 words. I have a contingency to sell. That's fine for me. Get that in writing, print it out, put it in your file. That'll be the thing that protects you. In general, what we're looking for here is as much clarity as you can possibly add. Now, what is a clause library? Clause libraries are pre-drafted addendum language that can be copied and pasted into the addendums. It is generally drafted either by a practitioner over the course of their career, what amounts to a historical archive of the language you have used, or it's drafted by an attorney in response to prompts. When you've got the general practitioner approach, it just means like you have those things where you go, oh, I remember back in '98, we had this crazy transaction that involved selling an oyster lease on a property of vacant vacant land out in the coastal range, and that oyster lease required this odd provision, and you'd have that language saved in your file somewhere, so if you ever have another oyster lease, you can pull this thing up and go, well, what worked and what didn't work well with this last one? Where did we have to add clarity? Where did we not? You've got that data. Now, that's the simple version of a clause library. The way that most people do clause libraries is they go to an attorney and say, draft us the following provisions so that we can use them. The Oregon Realtors Clause Library that we have, it is essentially the attorneys drafting clauses based on concepts, and we're getting it vetted through our task force right now to basically say what works, what doesn't work, what needs to be added, what needs to be changed. So that's what they end up looking like. Now, in general, the clause library for the Oregon Realtor side, we break it down into a couple places. We have a title that indicates what we call the clause. Now, these titles are not finalized, so be aware there's a couple that are going to sound a little silly. And we have an explanation that is meant to be a simple or moderately simple use case for that form. The example I have here is just a snip out of the actual clause library we have. This thing is a simple modification of purchase price. That's this clause. And the use of the clause is it is used to change the purchase price of a sales agreement clause or a sales agreement. And then the clause language itself is the purchase price in section 4A of the sales agreement or section 6A of the manufactured home and floating home sales agreement shall be amended to the blank number, and all references to purchase price in the sale agreement and any addendums thereto shall be references to this value. That would be the clause. You just copy and paste. And if there's language that's not applicable to you, you remove it. With the way that we drafted this, stuff in brackets is optional language. So this is the way that we've kind of created the Oregon Realtors one. Over time, we would love to get to a point where we have the technology so that we can just have it to be a drop-down menu, but that's going to require us working with the platforms and seeing what they can do. In its kind of nascent state, it's something where we just say, if it's in brackets, you make a choice. If it's not in brackets, don't make a choice. And so what this looks like is, for example, like this language here is choice language. If you are using a manufactured or floating home purchase and sale agreement, there is a different section that is being referenced here. Please note, the clause library from Oregon Realtors is designed to only really be used with the Oregon Realtors form because we're trying to add detail where we can. So it is internally referencing its own sections. We are referencing the financing sections of our own library forms. So if you're using it with a different library and just want this as the base, modify the section numbering because it won't be a perfect match. Does this mean that you can't use the Oregon Realtors Clause Library provisions, the copy and paste in, for example, an OREF general addendum? No, you can do that. But you do want to be more cautious, much more cautious, to make sure that the general addendum language is not focused in on a different contract. This is what we have in the library so far. It's kind of the broad strokes of it. This is the clause library's table of contents. This is subject to additions in the future, as well as potentially subtractions. We'll see there are a couple that are maybe going to be on the chop block, but most of them should stay. They are as follows: simple modification of purchase price, modification of payment terms in lieu of repairs. Note, lenders are not huge on the in lieu of repairs language. The reason why it's there is because that's theoretically what you should be doing, or else it's mortgage fraud to a certain extent. There is sort of a broad approval or acceptance of the concept of modifying the purchase price instead of doing repairs, but not telling the lender it's modifying the purchase price instead of doing repairs. And in fact, lenders sort of encourage it. I don't know what that says about the state of the economy, or the kind of moral fiber of the banking industry in general, but that it is what it is. We have final walkthroughs, closing extension, generic timeline extension clause, due diligence extension, extension to contingent right timelines, specifically for Form 2.10, the buyer's contingent right to purchase, and Form 2.12, the seller's contingent obligation to sell. A change of loan program, a change from cash purchase to loan program, a change from loan program to cash purchase. Each of those is its own separate area because they cause very different things to happen. Adding the ability to assign a contract to a third party. So if you haven't got it up front, but you want to make this contract assignable later on, you can do that. But be aware, it's changing the language is specific. Earnest money non-refundability, additional earnest money after acceptance. If there are some of these that you would like to see afterwards, please let me know. I've got the document up, and once we're done with this training, I can pull it up and we can kind of wander through a couple of them that you find interesting. Otherwise, I have a couple examples we will kind of walk through on these. Addition or a requirement that exempt seller nonetheless provide the seller's property disclosure statement. Let's see, anonymous attendee. What is our reliability as realtors when we are writing price adjustments due to repairs but not disclosing what it's for? It's a good question, and it has never really been fully plumbed. The simple answer is, in most cases, a loan is designed for very specific purposes, and in cases where your loan, for example, does not cover repairs to the property, in that instance, you would have a question. It's like if the seller says, I want to sell you the house, but I don't want to do the repairs, and you modify the purchase price because the repairs were kind of subtracted from it. Most lenders don't have a problem with that. So it's not a huge liability thing. But if you kind of go the opposite direction, sometimes you can have a situation where the buyer says, look, this roof needs to be, or the seller says, I'm going to repair the roof, but if we're going to repair the roof, raise the price, move the purchase price upwards because I have to pay for a new roof. In that case, you can get yourself into trouble because you are essentially saying, I'm going to use the mortgage, the money from the bank to not only buy the property, but to also buy the new roof, which may not be covered by your loan. I would say it's dependent largely on the loan program you're using itself, what the terms of the loan are, what the lender has allowed you to use it for. But if you are subtracting from the purchase price instead of doing repairs, very little restriction on that. The question then becomes whether the lender allows it or does not. Some lenders will say, don't even tell me. Other lenders will say, you're not allowed to do that. If they say you're not allowed to do that, I would say, don't do that, because ignoring what the lender tells you and doing it otherwise is what amounts to mortgage fraud. So if you have express designation or express direction from the lender to let them know when you are modifying the purchase price instead of doing repairs and you don't tell them, now you might be in trouble. Otherwise, I wouldn't say you have any large exposure to liability, but it's going to be dependent on the loan program itself. Where were we? Restrictions on permitted inspections. So reducing what inspections are allowed. Expansion on permitted inspections. If you want to do an asbestos test, you can add that, but you'd want to be very clear about how it works. Things that are kept by the seller. That title might change, but that's my best explanation for be real straightforward about who owns what at the end of the day, because sometimes you don't know. We had a really interesting legal hotline question at one point about a gigantic statue in a property that the buyer assumed was a fixture because it was 15,000 pounds. It was this huge granite statue. The seller, on the other hand, thought it was a movable piece of personal property. And so when closing came in and seller moved in with a flatbed and a forklift to take this statue out, the buyer was upset because they thought that statue was theirs. It's on the fine line of fixture and not fixture. To be honest, you could litigate it both directions. But that question is one of those things that could have been fixed by if you just in the general addendum said, seller wants to keep the statue. That is good enough. Even if you don't know if it's a fixture or personal property, this kind of a clause that says seller going to keep the statue, it cuts through that question of is it a fixture or is it not? And that sort of an answer is why that provision is there. Literally almost expressly caused by the someone steals a giant statue from the buyer's new house question. Things that will belong to the buyer, the corollary. Things that probably are fixtures, but the buyer would like to keep nonetheless. Ratification of previous decisions. Sometimes you'll make a decision and you're going to have a question. Was this the right thing to do? Maybe we messed up. Maybe the seller was allowed to terminate and they didn't, but we moved on anyways. And if your parties are skittish, a ratification is an affidavit that basically says, we all understand that maybe we made a mistake, but we understand that we are moving forward nonetheless, and we release everybody of the liability they're going to face if this problem shows up later on. It's basically a way to say, seller, you said you were fine with it. I want to hold you to that. Would you sign this document that says, yeah, I'm fine with it? And if the seller says no, well, now you got a question for yourself about whether you want to move forward or not. If the seller says, yeah, no problem, I'll sign that, you now have a written document that says all the parties understood that we messed up when we didn't order the appraisal on time, but we're fine with it because the appraisal was ordered. That's no longer a problem. Is there a timeline that the seller has to take their personal property? There is technically a timeline in the Oregon Realtors Purchase and Sale Agreement, which basically says at closing, seller's supposed to get the stuff out by closing. Now, you can modify that with a general addendum. I've seen that before in private practice where you have someone that sells their house but retains the next calendar year to remove all their stuff from the barn that they turned into an art studio kind of thing. That happens. And if you do that sort of thing, specify with very specific dates. Say buyer has, after buyer takes possession, seller to have 60 days to remove all their stuff. Or if you want to be even more clear about it, say seller has until February 5th to remove all their objects. More specificity is good, but you can put that timeline in there. There is no inherent, the default timeline is seller, get your stuff out by 5 p.m. on the closing date or the possession date if parties take possession at an earlier time. You can have a situation where possession moves before 5 o'clock if the parties agree to it, but generally you are correct on this one, Veronica. It would be 5 p.m. is when the seller is supposed to get their stuff off the property. Modification of a party name. This happens a lot and it's done improperly everywhere. So if you have, for example, a trust or a personal representative of the estate, the named party, the seller, is the estate of the dead person, the decedent, the estate of the decedent. You should make sure the name is estate of decedent, and the signatory is so-and-so, John Smith, personal representative of the estate of decedent. But what we see a lot is John Smith is named as the seller. John Smith doesn't own the property. Even as a personal representative or as a trustee, John Smith does not own the property. The trust or the estate owns the property, and so they should be the seller of the property. They just have a signatory who's allowed to sell it. The same is true for companies. You'll see every once in a while when a company sells a business, you'll have somebody put in like the name of their person they're working with. The president of the company is this named party. They're not, because the property is owned by the business, and the president is simply the person allowed to sign documents for the business. And so when you make that change to kind of make sure the contracts are very legal in the way they're supposed to be, use the modification of party names. It's important. Offer deadline extension. Technically, this is just an extension to an offer deadline. You don't actually need the other party to sign it. You can just pop that down on the form and you are good to go, because the other party doesn't need to agree with you when you change your own offer. If they mutually accept it, now you have to modify things therein, but you can change your own deadline without approval from the other party. A force majeure clause, otherwise sometimes known as an act of God provision. Force majeure is kind of the more secular version of that term. It is used for those, gosh, we didn't expect COVID to happen, and we didn't expect a boat to get stuck halfway between the Suez Canal, those kind of situations. Use of contingent or non-liquid funds, payment of for occupancy agreement, additional insulation disclosure information for Form 4.1 for an investment property, or for new construction rather. New construction properties have a requirement that there be certain information disclosed. At federal law, you have to disclose stuff about your insulation, and so there's just extra space if you need it. I see a question in chat that says, it seems like more and more sellers are leaving belongings behind when they move. What is the best way to write it in that they have to take everything by 5 p.m. of the closing date? Also, if you put in a penalty if they don't. Yeah. So the Oregon Realtors purchase and sale agreement put in a provision that basically said, seller, if you don't take your stuff with you by closing 5 p.m., it's not yours anymore. You have functionally abandoned it. You have legally abandoned it. It now belongs to the buyer. That is the Oregon Realtors approach. In OREF forms, there is no contract language that talks about what happens to objects left behind. They're supposed to clear out the property, but what happens if it's left behind? So you're left with what common law says, which is if you leave it behind, it's technically abandoned, and it's probably going to be the belonging of the buyer. There's case law on this that's more famous in kind of like, I think it was the Illinois area, where someone had sold their house, and then later on, the buyer was doing renovations, and they found $130,000 in rolled up money in the walls. Somebody stuck it behind the drywall. And the seller comes rolling back and goes, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I forgot I left all that money in the wall. It's mine. I would like it back. It wasn't in the sales agreement. And the court's response on that is, if you left it there, it's now the other party's. Yes, but what if they don't want it there and it costs money to get rid of? In the Oregon Realtors form, we have a thing in there that says if there is a cost involved in disposal of the objects, seller pays for it. That clause is not in the OREF forms. It might be added in the future. It's not a bad clause to have, but depending on which library you're in, it's going to change the answer. In Oregon Realtors, the seller pays for that disposal costs. How you get the money out of the seller after closing, that's more for the lawsuit to decide. That's for the small claims court to figure out. And in some cases, it's blood from a stone. If the seller sells you a house, there's a mountain of garbage in it, and the seller has moved to, I don't know, Siberia or something like that, you're not going to get the money out of that seller, and it's unfortunate. But that's just a bad person that did a bad thing, and we can't really do anything to stop that in form language itself. The contract can't stop it. But there is a provision in the Oregon Realtors one. Can you just add that wording to OREF in an addendum? Yes. all of the language can be added in an addendum if you want it in there. So that is something that you could absolutely add to OREF in an addendum. If you're using the purchase and sale agreement, you can say, look, if you don't get your junk out of this house before closing, you're paying for the disposal costs. You can, not that I'm suggesting copying, but imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. The Oregon Realtors provision we feel pretty comfortable with. It's the closing and possession and cleaning before closing, whatever it is, condition of the property at closing provision. I think it's section 46. I might be wrong on the section numbering, but in the Oregon Realtors forms, if you look at form 1.1, there is a provision and a clause that talks about cleaning up your junk at closing if you're a seller, and that language could theoretically be applied laterally or modified to work in your contract if you want that kind of provision in your agreement. Now, worth noting, if it's an addendum, the other party has to agree to it, which means as a default, if you haven't got that provision added to your contract yet and you want to add it, the seller can say, no, I don't want to do that. And if the seller says no, you're sort of stuck. Your option is either find a reason to terminate the contract and move forward in lieu of the seller saying, yeah, like no, with the seller basically just refusing to agree. So you're in sort of the question gets flipped. In theory, both forms will allow you to do the process. It's just a question of how you accommodate that or accomplish that task. Make sure let's see, I see Michelle said, make sure we all do our walkthroughs prior to closing. We'll talk about final walkthrough. It's actually a really interesting one because that was arguably the largest point of contention I had for the first training I ever did on Oregon Realtors forms in Lincoln County. They were like, where's your final walkthrough provision? And there's a reason why it's not there, and I'll show you. We'll cover it. It's one of my examples. We also have buyer's notice of an unacceptable well, buyer's notice of unacceptable septic systems, yuck. Additional information if you've got multiple associations. Sometimes you'll have a property that's in 2 associations simultaneously. It happens. It's not super common, but you've got extra space for that. And an indemnity provision for the client. So a way for the client to be indemnified from errors of the agent. It can be added to the agency agreements. It's not something that has to be. Some clients will be particularly concerned about that, and they will want extra indemnities, and you can have that there. So we'll start out with a couple examples. I'm going to start with the force majeure clause because this is one that doesn't really move very much. It is pretty set in what it is. The title of it is force majeure. It is a clause that is designed to create a safety net against unexpected events, allowing the parties to simply walk away from a contract that fails. These clauses are typically protective of buyers, but they in some circumstances can benefit the seller as well. The example would be, for example, like instance, a buyer wants to buy the house, a meteorite splatters it, the house is gone. The buyer doesn't want that house anymore. Force majeure, you can get out. Wildfire took the yard out, you can get out. That's fine. Alternately, force majeure could be something along the lines of, you're just going about your day and then a bird just crashes into a window and destroys it, and there's, bird pieces all over the house, and the seller goes, I can't fix the window in time for closing. What do you want me to do at this point? In some cases, buyers will use that as a way to squeeze sellers because they say, you promised me a window at closing and it's not. And you can, theoretically, a seller can also point to force majeure and say, we had no control over this completely unexpected event. I will terminate if you're going to force me in some way to deal with this, but otherwise, give me an extension because we have a force majeure that can allow this. So it can be used. It's not common for sellers. It's really more of a buyer provision than anything else, but be aware sellers also can gain rights from it. The way it reads, and this is quite a bit of text, neither party shall be liable to the other for any failure or delay of performance of any obligation under the sale agreement or any addenda thereto, to the extent that such failure or delay shall have been wholly or principally caused by acts or events beyond its reasonable control, rendering performances illegal or impossible. Force majeure. And any time that a party provides a notice of default, the party receiving the notice of default may assert force majeure during the cure period as an explanation for the default. If someone says, hey, you promised me you would have a clean house by closing, and the other party says, are you crazy? There was a snowstorm. No one could get in, within miles of this house. There was no cleaning that could have been done. You can use that as an explanation for your default. When force majeure is asserted, the defaulting party must prove in writing that the defaulting party made all reasonable efforts to remove, eliminate, or minimize such such cause of delay or damages, that the defaulting party has substantially fulfilled all other obligations at the time of the notice of default. Anytime that a party provides a notice of termination, they terminate the contract based on a resulting force majeure event, the buyer can assert force majeure along with the notice of termination, or in their response to termination, provide a writing that explains the claimed force majeure and states that the buyer made reasonable efforts to remove, eliminate, or minimize the cause of such delay or damages. If the buyer asserts a force majeure alongside the notice of termination or response to termination, they get their earnest money back. It's a way of regaining, of lassoing your earnest money back as a buyer if something crazy out of the ordinary happens. Let's say, for example, the government shuts down. It's an irregularity. Nobody can see it coming. It should never happen, but it does. And the banks shut down. Buyer's loan's not going to work. So what can the buyer do? Is the buyer, if the seller terminates at closing and they say, buyer, you didn't come ready, willing, and able to buy, and it's your fault, the buyer can say, there was an unordinary, an irregular event, an extreme event that caused this change. That's why it didn't work. That's why I should get my earnest money back. Another example, this one's a little bit more flexible. This is the things that are kept by seller provision. That title is going to change because I can never say it with a straight face. I need to find some better way of describing it because it just sounds corny at this point. The explanation is sometimes objects are on the fine line between a fixture or personal property. Since the default is that fixtures transfer with the land and personal property moves with the seller, those gray zone items can create complications and lawsuits. The parties can use this clause to cleanly define items that are going to be kept by the seller. So for example, this is the provision. It reads, the following items, regardless of the item's status as a fixture or as personal property, shall not be included in the sale, blank. Seller agrees to remove such items from the property prior to possession. Seller shall be responsible for the repair of any damages caused by the property to the property by removal of such any aforementioned items. If any of the above mentioned items remain on the property after possession, seller shall retain no rights in those items or the proceeds of the sale of such items. Buyer may pursue a claim against the seller to recover costs buyer incurs in removing or disposing of those items. So all of this language is incorporated in. Now note, for example, that provision on what do you do if the seller causes damage while removing the fixture. Let's say you're removing the giant statue and your flatbed truck breaks the pavers on the ground. If you just have buyer gets to keep the statue and that's your whole general addendum clause, you have a lawsuit. If you have this provision in place, you now can at least say, buyer, you got to fix this thing. It is your job to fix it. I don't see a feasibility contingency for rural properties, etc. I lift the language from NWMLS forms. That's one. Let us know about that because identification of fixtures is a good name. I like that. Shoot comments to us at forms@OregonRealtors.org for the things that you would like to see in the clause library. At this point, we want to add things to it, and this is just a situation where, in some cases, there are thoughts that have not been had yet. So, Michelle, that's a good idea. I would say, let us know about that. Shoot an email to forms and let us know what clauses you want to see in there because this is the way we can add them. If you were filling this out, for example, this is a literal one that popped up, a Ring doorbell device. Is it a fixture? Is it personal property? Gosh, I don't know. The literal answer is it a fixture? Well, is it a Generation 1 Ring doorbell device or is it a Generation 2 Ring doorbell device? Depending on which one it is, it's a fixture or personal property. Generation 2 and beyond, personal property. Generation 1 had to be hardwired into the wall. That's fixture. So if you want to keep it, if you're a seller that really likes it and your phone's already hooked up to it and all those things, take it with you. But specify, because if you're not really sure and you don't want to be the realtor that goes, oh yes, seller, it's definitely personal property, so we don't need to talk about that in the sales agreement, you might get in trouble when it doesn't come with them. We have these arguments in hotline things a lot. You'd be surprised at what people argue about in the fixture and personal property context. We had one call where people had literally birdhouses were personal property that was being kept by that was moving with the sale. So the buyer kept the birdhouses, but the seller had these birdhouses on little metal poles, and the seller wanted to keep the metal poles because they were personal property. And the buyer was like, so I'm getting birdhouses, but not the poles that you put them on. And they had what amounts to almost a small claims court dispute over something you can get at Walmart for like $7. That's how conflicting these can get, and that's why these provisions exist, to stop those arguments. Example that gets a little bit more flexible, a little bit more malleable, restrictions on permitted inspections. So for example, the Oregon Realtors Purchase and Sale Agreement permit a handful, or this is the explanation rather, the Oregon Realtors Purchase and Sale Agreement permit a handful of specific inspections such as sewer scopes, mold test, pest inspection, radon, oil tank locates. If the seller does not wish to permit there should be one or more of those inspections, or wishes to restrict other elements of the inspection, seller should or can use this provision to create such restrictions. The provision is not designed for usage in a Form 1.2 commercial purchase and sale agreement. It has different inspection procedures that go on in that, nor is it intended for use in a vacant land purchase and sale agreement, because there's also a somewhat different process that goes into that one. But the seller can make restrictions in the rest of them using this language. The way we've got it written at this point is, notwithstanding the language of the purchase and sale agreement's due diligence contingency permitting sewer scopes, mold tests, pest inspections, radon tests, oil tank locates, or if you're in a manufactured home and floating home agreement, permitted float inspections and all those things. The parties agree that the buyer shall not be permitted to perform blank the following inspection. And then you can also add potentially without seller's express written approval. I've got kind of taking pieces out. If you were to write this, notwithstanding the language of the purchase and sale agreement allowing sewer scopes and all those other things, the parties agree that buyer shall not be permitted to perform a sewer scope without seller's express written approval. It'll end up looking like this. That's what it would write as if you were to do it the way it's intended. So you start with this thing that has options and brackets and lines and slashes and all those things. You remove all the pieces you don't need, and you're left with a clause that reads as follows. And this is the way that you could use this. Now, there's also alternate language in some of these. The parties agree buyer may not do blank, or may not utilize the following inspection companies for any buyer inspections, or this and then this addendum will control an event that a provision conflicts with other provisions of the purchase and sale agreement. So you can set it up that says something like buyer is only allowed to do inspections between 1 and 3 p.m. on any given day. You can do that. This is how you would do it. That sort of thing can be done, and the parties can agree to this. The question of reasonability in a contract, if it says buyer is allowed to do all reasonable inspections, reasonability is defined. That takes backseat to what did you expressly say first. If you agreed, if the buyer agreed, I can only do inspections between 1 and 3 p.m., even though the contract says buyer allowed to do inspections at all reasonable times, the parties have agreed. Reasonable times means between 1 and 3 p.m. And it might even be unreasonable on one day to show up at 3 p.m. if there's like a parade in town that day or something, and you're just being crazy on the 4th of July. So there's broad ranges of uses. This alternate clause is a broader and wider version than the original one that is presented. In our clause library, we usually have the first option is kind of the most generic. The second option is going to be a little bit more off the road or off the trail, or in some cases just really broad. And that's okay in these cases to have broad language. Now, final walkthroughs are worth talking about because these are a point of contention at times. A final walkthrough. This is the title of the clause in the clause library. The explanation of use is this provision is to be used to outline the requirements or restrictions of a buyer's final walkthrough before closing. The provision is largely incomplete on its own and requires the broker to input specifics into the blank spaces to meet the client's needs. Bracketed language is optionally usable depending on a client's needs. Bracketed language is separated by a slash, indicates a list of options to select from, for example, this/that. So that's the baseline. Now it's got a lot of text, so bear with me. Here is our start point. Buyer shall be entitled to complete a personal inspection, final walkthrough of the property on the following day and time at blank. So blank date at blank time. You can also specify the final walkthrough may last no longer than blank number of hours. That's something that people are sometimes concerned about. You don't want a buyer just wandering the house for 6 hours just because. You can specify how long it's going to be. Such final walkthrough must happen before the earlier of the possession date or the closing date. The buyer and buyer's real estate agent shall be permitted to enter and review the property during the final walkthrough. Seller shall ensure buyer has access to the property for the final walkthrough. And then we get into some specifics, and this is different for every party. And the seller shall promptly provide notice that this final walkthrough to the tenants in a manner that complies with ORS 90 and the lease. So if you've got tenants inside, add this bracketed piece. Seller shall ensure buyer has access to all chambers, rooms, sheds, and structures on the property during the final walkthrough. And then we've got brackets for options. By being present at the time of the final walkthrough, is seller going to be at the house opening doors for the buyer? Or by providing buyer with keys so that they can do it themselves? If you've got, for example, a shed that is locked shut, the buyer might want to see what's in there. If the garage is separate and it's locked, and the buyer can only just peek through the window like a Dickensian street urchin, then you might actually have a problem because the buyer might want to know what's going on in that garage. If there's some door in the house that's locked, the door to the weird, creepy like cellar that exists in all the horror movies, that kind of thing, you've got that house, that seller should be unlocked because the buyer needs to be able to look in that place. They need to be able to do their final walkthrough in all places of the house they're going to own. So is the seller going to be present on the property? Is the seller going to give a buyer keys and access to it? Is the seller just going to unlock all doors and remove padlocks from all the chambers and whatnot for this final walkthrough? How do you ensure buyer gets access? During the final walkthrough, buyer may visually inspect the property and the property's condition and publicly accessible premises surrounding the property, just visually. You can also potentially add and may physically move or adjust personal property, including but not limited to furniture, rugs, paintings. This is one of the issues that does pop up in final walkthroughs. If the seller repaints the house, but they just paint around all their pictures. We've had this problem before where you get the new house and you're like, wow, this is nice. And you've got white walls and then like a really kind of off-white square where all the paintings used to be. Let the buyer move the paintings. If the buyer moves the paintings and goes, well, hold on, seller, what did you didn't paint under the paintings. Just take them off the wall and paint it. That's what you were supposed to do. You need to be able to move the paintings to see that. If there's furniture that covers a dead spot in the carpet, should the buyer be allowed to move that furniture? If you're a seller and you have furniture you don't want the buyer to touch, some antique armoire that you're worried about, don't put this provision in. If you're a buyer and you're worried about a dead spot under the carpet that the seller might be trying to hide, put this provision in. It becomes a very, very kind of context-specific question based on your buyer. The buyer agrees to indemnify, defend, and hold harmless seller from and against any loss or damage or cost that arises out of the actions of buyer or buyer's agent during the final walkthrough. If you tip over the antique armoire and damage it, buyer, you're in trouble. And then, this is where it gets really complicated. We have remedies. 3 options in the way we've drafted it. Option 1, after completing the final walkthrough, buyer may promptly notify seller of buyer's disapproval of the condition of the property and provide seller with a notice of termination. Upon such delivery of notice of termination, buyer gets the earnest money back. What happens if you have a bad final walkthrough? Can the buyer terminate? It's an option. After completion of the final walkthrough, buyer may promptly notify seller of buyer's disapproval of the condition of the property. Upon receiving buyer's disapproval, the parties must attempt to negotiate a solution before the closing date. If no solution to the disapproval is reached before the closing date, buyer may provide seller with a notice of termination at any point before 5 p.m. on the closing date, and upon such delivery of notice of termination, gets their earnest money back. Can you demand that they actually fix this thing? Can you try and negotiate a solution? Hey, seller, I moved the dresser and I couldn't help but notice there was a 3 square foot section of the carpet that was missing. It was just the floorboards. There was nothing there. That's not acceptable. You got to fix this. And if you don't fix it, I don't want the house, because what else are you hiding? That is an option that could be available to you. Or option 3. After completion of the final walkthrough, buyer may promptly notify seller of buyer's disapproval and of the condition of the property and provide a punch list of items explaining the cost to remedy buyer's various disapprovals. Upon receiving buyer's disapproval and the punch list, seller must promptly notify buyer that it either 1, plans to do the repairs and fix this stuff, or 2, shall provide a seller credit to buyer at closing equal to the value of the unresolved punch list items. If seller fails to promptly provide either of the above notices, buyer may provide a notice of termination. You can get out. You can say, seller, fix these things or I can terminate. And the seller gets the option to say, I will fix these things, or I'm not going to fix them, but I will pay you for it. Alternately, if none of these things are done, you can just terminate. Now, there's a 4th option, the kind of the hidden 4th option is having no remedy, which is literally just you don't put one of these in, and that's your whole final walkthrough, which means what happens if something goes wrong? Nothing. If you find the hole in the floor or the carpeting and you're a buyer and you did your final walkthrough and you have no remedy, then you just know there's going to be a problem with the carpet when you move in. And some people want that. Some final walkthroughs don't involve a remedy, but if you have a buyer that wants a remedy out of it, you need to put that in intentionally. The clause library takeaways. The takeaways to this whole training is clause libraries are a tool where a clause was drafted in advance to meet a large number of possible outcomes, as many as we possibly can in most cases. If you have a particularly specialized transaction or a unique scenario, the clause library may not match up to that situation. In those specific scenarios, you're best off drafting custom language or otherwise hiring an attorney to assist you in drafting that language. This is a springboard. It's a beginning point. It's not the final product. Now, should you use clause libraries whenever possible? Usually, yes, it's pre-drafted language. It's good for you. But don't use it as a panacea. It is not the ultimate balm. And that is our training on clause libraries and general addendums. Are there questions that linger, or would people like to see various pieces of a potential clause library? So on final walkthrough clauses, they must be agreed to earlier in the sales agreement, not at the last hour. That is the nice thing with the general addendum is it can be part of the original offer, at which point if they want to accept the offer, they also have to accept the general addendum that's attached to it. It's part of the offer. And if that's the case, it's agreed to at the first part. If, on the other hand, you don't have a final walkthrough, but you want to add it later, and you hand a seller the final walkthrough provision and say, hey, I'm a buyer, I want to have a final walkthrough. A seller never has to agree to any general addendum you hand them. They don't. They simply don't. So if you don't add it at the start as part of your offer, it is something that doesn't have to be in the contract, and the seller can stonewall you. Now, if the seller is agreeable and says, yes, I would love to add a final walkthrough provision, congratulations, you now have one. But if you want to guarantee that it is part of your transaction, it has to be in there at the start. That's the only way to guarantee it. Questions, or otherwise that's our hour. That's the whole thing we've got. I release you back to your Fridays and enjoy your weekend. Let's see. We see. So the clause language gets put on a general addendum, specific separate forms. Clause language gets put on a general addendum is a separate form, but it's a separate form that is a portion of the purchase and sale agreement if the parties agree to it. Broadly, what that means is if you have a general addendum, you just put language on it, it's only a notice at that point until the other party signs it. If both parties sign it, it's now part of the sales agreement. When are these available? Right now, we have them working through our task force. It's uncertain how long it'll take. It also depends on how many comments we get back from people with things they want to see added. These take time to draft, and they take time to draft with kind of like all the thoughts involved. The hope is at some point before the end of the year, but I can't guarantee that. We're also in negotiations with the forum platforms, and we're going to see what we can kind of get them to do on this as well. So if, for example, we're talking with Zip Forms and we say, hey, Zip Forms, we would like our forms to be on your library. We also have this cool new product that people would like to see. It's a forms clause library. Can you do that? Zip Forms might say, yeah, we can do that, but it's going to take 4 months to program. So I can't give you a really good estimate on when it's going to be launched. We are working diligently on it, though. We are just working our way at this like a busy little beaver and trying to get it released as well as we can. Let's see. When do you expect it to be released? My hope is by the end of the year. I can't guarantee that though. More likely than not, it'll be something that you won't see on platforms until sometime midway into 2024. I'm guessing probably February 2024. But this is all just me shooting straight from the hip. I have literally no idea on the actual timelines. Presumably, if we can do something with less technology, if it's something that's not drop-down menus in a platform like a Zip Forms or something like that, this sort of clause library language, which basically just assumes that the brokers will be sophisticated enough to use it with copy and pasting and subtracting and editing as necessary, this could be up on the library by the end of the year, or on the website by the end of the year pretty easily. Will we get copies of slides from today? Yes, I can send the slides out to people. We'll do that. We usually do that afterwards. So I'll get a copy of the slideshow out to people. Heads up, in the slideshow, however, it is worth noting the PDF version of this is not going to have a super great version of my fun little animation of that one. All you'll have is this picture. You won't have the knife firing its way into the peanut butter jar and getting squished around on the plate. So it's not as good in PDF format, but we'll get that out to you. Comments on the MLS that say seller wants offer on OREF. This doesn't mean buyer can't use Oregon Realtors, right? That is correct. If there is a comment on the MLS that says a preference of the other party, you do not have to actually adhere to that. It's just something that's worth noting. If the party is concerned enough to specify on the MLS, you usually want to adhere to that. It's in the same context as like seller saying something along the lines of like seller will never accept an offer that includes an inspection contingency. You can put an offer in with an inspection. You can say, seller, I understand that you don't want to allow people to inspect your house, but I think I have a good enough offer that you still want it, even though I'm going to inspect the house. You just have to do it kind of with your eyes open, that you are ignoring a direct kind of request of the other party, which makes your offer inherently look worse. If you do send in an offer on the Oregon Realtors forms and the other party refuses to show it to their client, like literally never shows it to the client, and they don't have some express directive from the client that says never give me an offer that is on blank, that's a violation of ORS 696-805. That's a party that's just simply not providing all written communications and all offers to their client, and that's a problem that shouldn't happen. If you have someone that says I will never give you these give these forms to my client because I don't want them to see this, be reasonable people. It is a reasonable field. The same is true in the other direction. If you have someone that says we'll only accept forms on Oregon Realtors and you put one in on OREF, they have to present the offer. You still have to present the offers. Your job is to present offers, unless you have very express direct information from your client that says I don't want the following things. But I haven't heard of any clients that have given that express direction yet on the hotline, and it just doesn't seem that common. It's usually the kind of the broker leading the witness and then having that happen. If the seller has executed an OAR form and receives an OREF offer, can we still use Oregon Realtors property disclosure form? Yes. The seller's property disclosure statement is the one form that is cross-compatible. You can cross-pollinate in both libraries. It is simply usable in both worlds. Everything else is more individual and less statutory, and so the forms themselves are not pre-drafted by the state, and as a result, you don't really want to mix anything else other than the SPDS. Do you have to do a response on the same set of forms? No, you do not, but it is worth noting if you do the response improperly, the way counteroffers work, you may unintentionally imprint the original language of the offer in, and you would have what amounts to an Oregon Realtors offer that has all of the literal text from the OREF document, which is inherently a contradiction that you get problems with. In the Oregon Realtors library, we created what we think is a relatively straightforward and streamlined solution to this, which is, I'll pull up a version of it. There's a counteroffer that we created in our library that is called the counteroffer onto Oregon Realtors forms. It's a counteroffer which basically says, this counteroffer is a flat rejection of the other party's offer. I reject all terms and conditions in that offer. Instead, check out the attached offer, and then you fill out the Oregon Realtors offer and the addendums and all the stuff for it and send it over. So if you're a seller and you say, look, buyer, I get that you got a great offer and I love the terms of it, but I want to be on this library because I trust it more, because I know it, I'm trained on it, whatever it ends up being, you can use this document to basically say, buyer, I've recreated, I've replicated your original offer in living color on this form that I've attached. If you like it, it's the same terms. Review it, tell me what you think, but it's the exact purchase price. You keep the same fixtures. It's all the main terms that you liked with maybe a modification or maybe something different. But it's essentially the seller saying, actually, buyer, instead, I offer to you this interesting new form library that I would like to stay on and view these things. And you can do it that way. The buyer can do the rejection as well. But because it is a flat rejection of the counteroffer rather than an incorporation of the previous language, you're then left with basically whatever the document is the seller hands, or the party delivering this counteroffer hands you. That is the terms of the agreement, and ensures you don't have an accidental copy-paste problem that happens with counteroffers if done improperly. Other questions? I can do this all day. I am the legal hotline. This is what we do. All right, seeing none. Everyone have a wonderful Friday and a good weekend. We'll hopefully get this clause library out to folks relatively soon, have it be something that people can make use of as quickly as possible, but within reason, to make it a high quality product. With that, I think that's our training for the day. Katie, if you want to hit the button.